Building Canada Act faces 5-day deadline. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Bill C-5 is being put through the House of Commons in Canada. And normally this would go through rather a long-term procedure where all parties would have an opportunity to examine it, scrutinize it, offer their opinions, suggestions, changes. They'd have an opportunity to see if some change within that act has some implications for other existing legislation. But the Liberals have put forward a motion to limit discussion on Bill C-5 to only 5 days. So they're hoping to have it passed through Parliament by the 20th of June, and then it would go to the Senate for approval. Robert Lyman is a longtime policy analyst, and he's had a look at the bill, and he has some comments. So I put them together in a PowerPoint that I want to share with you, and I hope you'll share it with everyone you know. So the key points are that the Carney Liberal government has put forward a motion to limit consideration of Bill C-5, which includes the Building Canada Act, to 5 days. This act is intended to accelerate the regulatory review of nation-building projects. This means that by June 20th, 2025, the bill could be passed and sent to the Senate for approval. Normally, the process would see the bill go to committee and be scrutinized by Parliament, something which could take a few months. But with this motion, the discussion and scrutiny of the bill would be limited to 5 days. According to the government, without urgent action, Canada will be placed at risk. What's the rush? They say we need to move. The Liberals defend their plan to ram through major projects bill before Canada Day. Now note, this legislation also looks to break down internal trade barriers and make it easier for workers to take jobs in other provinces. So that sounds good and important for many people, but what are the implications? Now we have to realize we have a net zero government. That's the goal they're trying to reach. Net zero is destroying the EU and UK economies, and Canada is not far behind. At the same time, people are hopeful. They're scared and excited that Bill C-5 will jumpstart projects in just a 2-year time frame. So, we've often heard Prime Minister Carney say, we're going to have to do things previously thought impossible at speeds not seen in generations. But is that the right thing to do? Will we be building ports and pipelines? Or pet net zero projects? And this is very important. Shortly after the Premier's meeting in Saskatchewan on June the 2nd, 2025, Premier Tim Houston out of Nova Scotia proudly supports the Eastern Energy Partnership. That's not Energy East pipeline. That's something different. But it gives people in the West kind of the wrong impression. It sounds like, oh, they're interested in oil and gas pipelines. And their contribution from Nova Scotia is called Wind West, a bold step forward in clean energy that would create jobs, attract investment, strengthen our economy with a new transmission cable that would get our energy to market. Wind West puts Nova Scotia at the heart of Atlantic Canada's energy future. So he's proposing not only a small project right now, but he's proposing that they could build 66 gigawatts of offshore wind farm. And sadly, the media is only reporting on the line costs of the transmission line of $8 billion. The actual wind farm cost would be astronomical. And one of the groups promoting this concept is the Canadian Climate Institute. It's primarily a government-funded think tank. As you can see here, they got almost 80% of their funding from the government, and this is from the CRA. And in their article, they say that a 15 gigawatt facility would cost about $60 to $80 billion. So actually a 66 gigawatt farm would cost between $264 and $352 billion. Where's that money going to come from? A 66 gigawatt wind farm of 264 to 352 billion would represent 12% to 17% of Canada's entire 2024 GDP. Canada has struggled to get its military spending up to 2% of GDP. So even if these expenses are spread over several years or even a decade, the cost to individual taxpayers would be enormous. So the risk with Bill C-5 is that net zero projects may get priority thanks to Bill C-5 because they appear to have shorter construction times, and lots of EU wind projects are stalled. Will we inherit their junk? This is an important report to read from the Global Warming Policy Foundation out of the UK. And one of the key points they make is that the cost of renewable energy has been underestimated. And that's in the UK. The same thing happens here. And this is also a very important Substack from David Turver, who publishes under Eigenvalues. But he's pointing out that the power price in the US has remained pretty much flat, but the power prices in the UK have simply skyrocketed. And that's mostly due to all the subsidies and contracts for differences for wind and solar farms. Natural gas prices do weigh into that, but it's not the main driver of cost. So Robert Lyman wrote this blog post, which is on our blog, The Federal Plan to Accelerate Pipeline Building, Let's Pretend. And it turns out he examines the reality of major projects. And, they just take time. Bill C-5 will do nothing to change the fact that major projects take time. And if you wonder who Robert Lyman is, he's a retired energy economist who for 27 years served in the Canadian government as an advisor, manager on energy, environment, and transportation issues, and has written extensively on these issues since that time. So you can read that on our blog for the full detail. I will touch on some of the aspects of it in this presentation. Now here's an example. Everyone's been pretty keen on critical minerals as something that could be jump-started in just a couple of years. But in fact, getting a mine up and running takes about 16 years, 17 years. And that's just how long it takes. So this is where S&P did this study. They looked at, something like 150 mines from all over the world. And in general, that's how long it takes. So the Build Canada Act will not change that. And if we look at pipelines or the other projects like that, this is an excerpt of what Robert wrote. Your company's internal planning process for a major project can easily take 18 to 36 months. 18 to 36 months can be required for analytical work, preliminary engineering, and design and environmental field studies. By the time the initial filing of an application for a certificate is made, you may have spent up to 5 years or more investigating and analyzing the project. You will also have had to prepare a consultation paper to use with landowners, communities, and Indigenous groups. The consultation paper, in fact, will come near the end of a lengthy and expensive process. These are all things that won't change under Bill C-5. And it's curious that there's a push for faster approvals when in fact the Liberal climate policies have halted over $600 billion in hydrocarbons-related energy infrastructure since 2015. So you can see them all listed here. It's an absolute fortune in investment and opportunity for Canada and thousands of jobs. They've all been blocked. So 10 years of blockadia. Robert goes on to say, it's therefore striking that a political party that has spent the past 10 years throwing up barriers to construction of new energy infrastructure should now find that it is urgent to pass Bill C-5 that will only slightly remove those barriers. But there are other issues with Bill C-5 and the push to rush it through Parliament. The Building Canada Act is flawed as legislation. So Robert writes that good legislation should clearly state both its objectives and the measures that it proposes to authorize. It should explain who, for example, which minister of the government, will be authorized to exercise the authorities, and according to which public interest criteria the judgments will be made. It will cause probably a replacement of current due process. So in essence, the bill authorizes the replacement of the current processes for review of major projects. For instance, the review by both the Impact Assessment Agency and the Canadian Energy Regulator, or whichever other federal regulator is appropriate, in accordance with their separate pieces of legislation, with a new process that one can only assume will be some combination of the existing ones. But the bill does not identify the new agency. It does not provide any guidance as to the criteria that the agency will operate under to assess projects. It does not designate the minister that will be authorized to establish the agency and decide whether to accept or reject its findings and recommendations before they're put forward to Cabinet. And it does not define the limits, if any, that will be imposed on the discretion exercised by either the minister or Cabinet. And timely? How is this supposed to improve the performance of the existing review processes in terms of timely reviews? And I recommend for those of you who are interested in this topic to look at this Canada West Foundation paper, which is linked here. And they discuss the current system of approvals for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has been amassing substantial experience in managing phase 1 of the process. However, it hasn't gotten to the hard parts yet. So that's just crazy. This was done in 2023, I believe. Have a look at it and just see what you think about it. So Robert goes on to write that the choice of lead ministers is especially important related to this bill. Will it be climate? Now the impact assessment process is essentially led and controlled by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, while the review of the Canada Energy Regulator's findings is the responsibility of the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. So choosing the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to lead the new process would essentially guarantee that no conventional energy project, with the possible exception of a nuclear plant, would ever get approved. Or would it be the economy? Choosing the Minister of Natural Resources to lead the process would imply that economic considerations would be given equal or even preferential consideration over environmental concerns, and thus infuriate the green lobbyists. And there's lots of those. And they're well-funded, they're strategically coordinated. The ENGO actors are on standby to stop whatever they think is not green or clean. So this is one of their campaigns, and it's called the Fair Share Platform for Global Climate Equity. And you can see there's a number of organizations that are involved here. You should note that CANRAC is an umbrella organization of about 115 or so other climate activist groups, unions, faith groups. So, it's really a huge number of people. They do a lot of point-and-click campaigns. They have lots of volunteers with boots on the ground. So they're just on standby. And today, Tim Hodgson, who is the Minister of Energy and Resources, Natural Resources, tweeted this, saying, "We promised one Canadian economy by Canada Day, and we're working to deliver. Once passed, the One Canadian Economy Bill will dismantle internal trade barriers, kickstart major projects," and we just found out that that's not actually true, "and advance economic reconciliation." Learn more from my colleague, Minister Gull Masti, about how by strengthening and uniting provincial, territorial, and Indigenous economies, we'll all rise together. So even they're talking about one Canadian economy, it seems that there's special treatment for the Indigenous economy in the bill. I don't know if many Canadians are aware of the fact that the cost of claims approved thus far for Indigenous claims, at this point when Tom Flanagan wrote this in 2023, was $27.8 billion in payments to individuals, $31.9 billion for payments to organizations, and promises of improved services for a total of almost $60 billion. Claims now in progress are likely to add significantly to these sums. So you should note that there's only 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada, and we're talking about $60 billion and more. And if you want more evidence of that, Trevor Tombe tweeted this just at the time of the federal economic statement that came out at Christmas time. And that was when Chrystia Freeland, of course, had resigned rather abruptly, and lots of chaos. And he said, with all the goings on, there's probably no interest in why the 2023-24 deficit grew from $40 billion to $62 billion, just in case there's a 75% due to contingent liabilities related to Indigenous rulings and awards. So that's here. That's a substantial sum of money. Now, there is in Canada this thing called the Aboriginal industry, and here's one example of people who are looking to tap into access to Indigenous funding on projects, and that would be at Deloitte. This is just one example of consultancy firms who are doing this, and they're doing bringing carbon down to earth, Indigenous leadership in nature-based climate solutions. So just to put this in perspective, so there's 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada, and Deloitte as a firm has 450,000 people working for it worldwide. So Indigenous communities, generally speaking, are very small. Most of them are probably around 500 people. Maybe, I think some of the largest ones are maybe 12,000 people. So that's barely the size of a small city. And what does that mean? It means that within that small community, there simply are not the human resources to actually put to all of these big projects. You wouldn't have a collection of Indigenous engineers, managers, project managers, skilled tradespeople, etc., all in one community of that size. It just simply doesn't exist in terms of human resources. I was a career counselor, so I can tell you that. So anyway, that's not any kind of a statement against a community trying to get a project going. My point is really that other people will cash in, and there may be a handful of a few people in that community who do benefit. But we've seen this over and over again across Canada. There are a few people who do benefit, and we still have abject poverty on most reserves. So obviously people are intending to capitalize on this. And there's something in the renewables community that is very closely tied with Indigenous projects, because Indigenous projects get sustained government funding. So that implies that the renewables project will also get sustained government funding, your money. So these are things that should be looked at very closely in Bill C-5, and no one can look at them closely in the space of 5 days. It's impossible. So that's a caution. And how does Article 6, international carbon trading, fit into the One Canada concept? Again, no one has any time to examine that. In fact, we haven't heard much about Article 6. This is part of the Paris Agreement, and in fact, the Paris Agreement enabled Article 6, international carbon trading, which dates right back to Enron and Kyoto. So you can go on the government website, you can see that so-called nature-based climate solutions are a prominent part of Canada's climate plan. And what it really is, it's like paying indulgences. It's like in the medieval times, if you sinned, you would go to the church and, you'd confess your sin, and then they'd tell you how much you had to pay to be relieved of that sin. And today the sinning is the emissions of carbon dioxide and other GHGs, and the carbon tax is your indulgence payment. How much do I have to pay to rid myself and my company of this sinful activity? So they're planning to have international carbon trading, and climate activists, people like Catherine McKenna, are very keen on Canada trading on its natural resources, not its oil, gas, and coal and rare minerals. No, on its wilderness, its water, its forests. So you probably don't know anything about this. Is this the first time you've really heard about it? Well, that's another angle that should be looked into that's related to this bill. But we can't do it in 5 days. So Parliament is in the dark on Bill C5. So Robert Lyman writes, logic and politics would argue for designating neither one, meaning not the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and not the Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, but instead designating either the Prime Minister, which is unlikely, or someone like the President of the Privy Council, like Dominique Leblanc, or the Minister of Industry, Mélanie Joly. The point is that this is of crucial importance, and Parliament is being asked to approve the bill without knowing the answer. And Robert writes that bad legislation makes for bad government, and we've already had enough of that. So I'd like to bring this book to your attention and this quote. This is by Hans Rosling. He was a medical doctor and a public policy health expert, worked all over the world, Swedish fellow, brilliant guy. And he wrote in this book, fear plus urgency leads to stupid, drastic decisions with unpredictable side effects. And I think that that's what we're facing with ramming Bill C5 through Parliament without proper debate. So we should stop the rush on Bill C5. Due parliamentary and legislative process must be observed. And to give you more background to the very brief overview I've given you, please do read our reports. They're all on our blog. This is the most recent one by Robert Lyman, Canada's Infrastructure Selection Criteria, Deciphering the Rhetoric. This is the one he wrote just before that, Energy Superpower versus Net Zero. Can we really say that Canada will be an energy superpower if we are also still planning to reach net zero? So we're suggesting don't just jump. Might not fly. And of course, all the time we're told that every country in the world is rushing to meet net zero and that they're getting closer. And this report shows that these are all broken promises and false narratives. How long can the net zero charade go on? We have some more resources on our blog, the Climate Gordian Knot, and this addresses whether the Alberta Accord could be a test of cooperation with the Carney government. And this is just a shorter item about Beyond Oil. Beyond Oil and Gas is basically a project between, I think it's between Denmark and the province of Quebec. And the Trottier Foundation funds a lot of it, a lot of the activism related to it. But this report by Robert Lyman shows that, in fact, oil and gas demand is going up all over the world and is deemed to do so for the next foreseeable future significantly. But sadly, the finance community, and that's where Prime Minister Mark Carney comes from, is pushing an impossible net zero ideology. So we wrote to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions about the fact that this new book by Václav Smil, which appears to be only in French, but there is a French and English summary here. He's just saying that 2050, how a world without carbon is almost impossible. So, pourquoi un monde sans carbone est presque impossible? So, I invite you to read this version, the English or the French, and just see what a ridiculous goal it is. No one did the due diligence before coming up with net zero, and it's actually destroying economies around the world, and we will be next. So we invite you to join us in the race from net zero. Please order our little book here. It's 88 pages, facts on 22 prominent climate topics, energy and climate at a glance. It's a great little book, and it'll set the context for you and help you argue the case that we have to run away. We have to race from net zero. And you can order the book on our website. So that's a pretty short, quick overview of these rather complex issues. But the point is that, as stated in the opening, for the past 10 years, the Liberals have set up policies and barriers to all kinds of hydrocarbon developments. And they've enshrined net zero in law in Canada, even though the Paris Agreement is entirely voluntary in its original form. And now they suddenly want to rush this big issue through Parliament. They want to ram it through in 5 days without proper consultation and proper due diligence. So you can imagine that we could be headed for a real mess, as if we don't have one already. So my objective in bringing this to your attention was simply to make you aware. I'm sure a lot of people are going off on vacation soon. They're not thinking about Parliament, and Parliament's going to sit or rise for the summer. They're taking the summer off. So they really want to ram this thing through, give it over to the Senate for approval, and it's completely unrealistic, as I showed you. It will not be jump-starting projects. It will not be making miraculous building projects, nation-building projects start tomorrow, but it could very easily lead to a lot of tax dollars being drained into the pet projects of net zero advocates. And that's a really big problem. It's already a big financial problem for every Canadian. We've got lots of reports showing that your pockets are just being drained by climate policies, and it's not affecting global climate to the good in any way. So please have a look at the materials I offered. Thank you so much for listening to this rather long presentation, and I hope that we can get some common sense and sanity and have a proper review of this legislation. Thank you. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.